10%. That number appeared in July 2026, and the Linux community reacted the way it reacts to very few pieces of news, with genuine, uncontained excitement. Forum posts spread across Reddit, Mastodon, and technology communities within hours. Screenshots of the statistic appeared in social media feeds. Commentary from Linux advocates, Windows critics, and technology journalists all converged on the same conclusion. Linux had finally done it. After decades of being dismissed, after years of being the operating system that enthusiasts loved and mainstream users ignored, after countless predictions that this year would be the year of the Linux desktop, the number was finally there. Double digits. 10% of the North American desktop market. But here's the question that the celebration moved past too quickly. If Linux genuinely captured 10% of North American desktop usage, where exactly did those users come from? And why did it happen so fast that virtually nobody saw it coming? Those questions have answers. And the answers change the story completely. Before examining what the number actually means, it is worth establishing why 10% would represent a genuinely historic moment if it were real. Linux has existed as a desktop operating system for more than 30 years. Throughout most of that time, its share of mainstream desktop usage has been measured in fractions of a single percentage point, consistently present in the data, consistently dismissed as statistically negligible, consistently the subject of jokes inside the Linux community itself about the perpetually approaching year of the Linux desktop. The reasons for Linux's desktop struggles are well documented. Windows dominance created an ecosystem gravity that made alternatives progressively harder to choose. Software developers wrote for Windows because Windows had the users, and users stayed with Windows because the software was there. Printer drivers, gaming clients, professional applications, enterprise productivity suites, all of them assumed Windows as the baseline and treated everything else as secondary. Linux users learned to work around these limitations, to find alternatives, to compile software themselves when pre-built packages were unavailable. They developed a community culture that celebrated technical mastery and treated the barriers to entry as a reasonable filter rather than a problem to be solved. That culture produced an operating system loved intensely by a small population and ignored entirely by a large one. Against that backdrop, a genuine jump to 10% of North American desktop usage would not merely be a statistical milestone. It would represent a fundamental shift in the structure of desktop computing, a break in the ecosystem gravity that has held Linux in its niche for 3 decades. It would demand an explanation of the same scale as the number itself. The specific figure is StatCounter's July 2026 data for North American desktop operating system usage, which showed Linux at approximately 10.65%. StatCounter is one of the most widely cited sources for operating system market share data, which means understanding what it actually measures is essential for evaluating what any specific figure from it actually means. StatCounter derives its operating system statistics from the web traffic flowing through websites that use its analytics code. When a browser visits one of those websites, it transmits information about itself, including the operating system running the device, through a field called the user agent string. StatCounter reads those user agent strings across billions of page views and calculates what percentage of observed traffic was generated by each operating system. This methodology captures real web activity at genuinely enormous scale. It is updated continuously. It spans a geographically diverse sample of websites, and it reflects actual usage patterns rather than survey responses that can be shaped by how questions are framed. It also measures something specific, the operating system distribution of web traffic, not the operating system distribution of installed personal computers. These two things can be similar. They can also diverge significantly when the population of devices generating web traffic differs from the population of devices sitting on desks and in homes. That distinction between measuring traffic and measuring installed devices is the first crack in the 10% celebration. The second crack appeared when people who study these numbers for a living looked at how Linux's share had moved between previous months and July 2026. The increase was not gradual. It was sudden. And sudden changes in operating system market share, absent some obvious explanation like a major platform launch or a dramatic news event, require an explanation. Statistical trends in operating system market share typically move slowly. The installed base of personal computers is large. The pace at which people change their computing habits is measured in years rather than months, and the month-to-month movement in market share figures, even during periods of genuine transition, tends to be measured in fractions of percentage points rather than dramatic jumps. Linux crossing 10% in North American desktop traffic in a single measurement period, against a backdrop where its previous figures had been significantly lower, is the kind of movement that demands a mechanical explanation. Real users do not migrate from one operating system to another in the volumes that would be required to produce this change in the time frame that the data implies. The corresponding Windows figures in the same period showed movement that raised similar questions. If Linux gained several percentage points, something had to lose those points, and the distribution of that loss across Windows, macOS, and the unknown category required examination that the initial celebration did not provide. The unknown category is particularly relevant here because StatCounter's data has shown anomalous unknown category behavior in recent months that was examined in a previous discussion. A large unknown category can distort the apparent shares of every identified operating system by changing the denominator of the calculation. When unknown grows, identified categories can appear to grow or shrink as proportions of the remaining identified traffic, even when the absolute number of their page views has not changed. But the Linux figure in July 2026 raised a specific and different concern from the unknown category anomaly. This concern pointed towards something that the operating system market share community had been aware of but had not fully accounted for in its standard analysis. Here is the midpoint of this story. The explanation that changes how the 10% figure must be understood. Web traffic is not generated exclusively by human beings sitting at computers and browsing websites. A significant and growing proportion of internet traffic is generated by automated systems, bots, crawlers, scrapers, AI agents, testing frameworks, and other software that visits websites without any human directing each individual request. These automated systems have operating systems too, in the sense that they run on machines that report operating system information through the same user agent mechanism that browsers use. And the operating systems represented in automated traffic are not distributed in the same way as the operating systems used by human desktop computer users. Linux dominates server infrastructure. The machines running automated web traffic, the servers from which bots and crawlers and AI agents operate, run Linux at rates that far exceed Linux's presence on consumer desktops. If a meaningful portion of the traffic flowing through StatCounter's measurement system is automated rather than human-generated, that automated traffic carries a Linux fingerprint that inflates Linux's apparent share of what the data is supposed to be measuring: human desktop computer usage. The scale of automated and AI-generated traffic on the internet has been growing substantially as AI systems that browse, scrape, and interact with web content have proliferated. AI agents building training datasets, AI systems monitoring web content, automated testing frameworks, checking website functionality. All of these generate traffic that web analytics systems were not designed to handle separately from human traffic. Cloudflare, whose infrastructure sits between clients and websites in ways that give it visibility into traffic patterns that website-level analytics cannot easily achieve, has reported data on human versus automated traffic that tells a significantly different story about Linux's actual share of human-generated desktop browsing than StatCounter's July 2026 North American figure implies. This does not prove that the StatCounter figure is wrong in a simple sense. StatCounter measures what it measures: the distribution of operating systems across all traffic it observes. But if the goal is understanding what operating systems human beings are using on their desktop computers, a measurement system that cannot reliably separate human traffic from automated traffic is measuring something adjacent to that goal rather than the goal itself. The bot and automation concern is serious enough to make the 10% figure unreliable as a measurement of Linux's actual desktop installed base. That conclusion is important and should not be minimized. But swinging from the excitement of 10% to the dismissal of all Linux growth would be its own form of inaccuracy. And the evidence for genuine real-world Linux growth, independent of the July 2026 StatCounter figure, is present and worth examining honestly. Windows 10's end of support on October 14, 2025, created a population of users facing unavoidable decisions about their computing future. Machines that could not run Windows 11 due to hardware incompatibility needed a path forward. For a segment of those users, particularly those with older hardware that ran well on lighter operating systems, and those who had already been frustrated with Windows 11's direction, Linux represented a genuine alternative that they investigated seriously for perhaps the first time. Linux Mint's download statistics, while not publicly detailed in the same way as commercial operating system metrics, have been cited by the distribution's own developers as reflecting sustained growth during the post-Windows 10 end-of-support period. Mint's specific focus on Windows transition accessibility, the familiar interface, the included multimedia codecs, the hardware detection improvements, makes it a natural landing point for users whose first Linux experience is motivated by Windows frustration rather than open source ideology. Steam's hardware survey, which measures the operating system distribution of its active gaming user base, has shown Linux's share within that specific population growing gradually over the period since Valve committed to Linux gaming through the Proton compatibility layer. Steam's Linux figures are not a proxy for overall desktop Linux usage. Gamers who use Steam represent a specific demographic with specific technical comfort levels and specific motivations for running Linux. But they are a real measurement of a real population, and the trend within that population is genuinely upward. Developers have been another category of real Linux growth that predates and is independent of the July 2026 controversy. The professional developer community's shift toward Linux as a daily driver, driven by the alignment between the Linux desktop environment and the Linux server environment where most applications are ultimately deployed, is documented in annual developer surveys across multiple years and represents organic, motivated adoption rather than a statistical artifact. The methodological question that the July 2026 controversy raises is ultimately about which dataset is most useful for answering a specific question. If the question is what operating systems are generating web traffic across all sources, human, automated, and ambiguous, StatCounter's data answers that question with considerable scale and reasonable methodology. The July 2026 North American Linux figure of 10.65% is a real answer to that question. If the question is what operating systems human beings are using on their personal desktop computers, the question that the viral coverage of the figure implied it was answering, then a dataset that cannot separate human browsing from automated traffic is providing an incomplete answer to a different question. Cloudflare's data on human traffic patterns provides a perspective that complements StatCounter's web analytics approach. Because Cloudflare operates at the network infrastructure layer rather than the website analytics layer, its visibility into traffic includes signals about whether requests are generated by human browsers or automated systems that website-level analytics cannot reliably distinguish. Reports citing Cloudflare's human traffic data in the period surrounding July 2026 painted a substantially different picture of Linux's share of desktop usage than the StatCounter figure implied. The Steam hardware survey, for all its demographic specificity, provides something that web analytics cannot: a measurement where the population being measured is reasonably well defined, and where the data collection method is not subject to bot inflation in the same way that open internet web analytics are. Steam's Linux figures are real measurements of real people who have chosen to use Steam. They are not representative of all computer users, but they are representative of something real. The lesson the July 2026 controversy teaches about market share data is not that any single source is reliable or unreliable in a binary sense. It is that every measurement methodology answers a specific question about a specific population, and the viral spread of a single dramatic figure can create the impression that a measurement is answering the most important question when it is actually answering a related but different one. The 10% figure, whatever its methodological reliability, arrived in a context that made it instantly comprehensible to anyone who had been paying attention to the desktop computing landscape. Windows 10's end of support created real migration pressure. Windows 11's hardware requirements excluded real machines. The user frustration with Windows 11's direction, the advertising in the Start menu, the Microsoft account requirements, the progressive deepening of cloud integration, was real and documented. The enthusiasm with which the Linux community greeted even a questionable 10% figure reflects the genuine sense that Windows is creating more motivation for users to explore alternatives than it has generated in years. Microsoft's real challenge in this context is not the July 2026 StatCounter figure. It is not even the question of whether Linux is genuinely approaching 5 or 6 or 7% of actual desktop usage. Microsoft's real challenge is the combination of push and pull dynamics that makes the question of alternatives more relevant to more users than it has been at any previous point in desktop computing's mainstream history. The push is Windows 11's direction, a platform moving toward greater cloud integration, greater AI feature embedding, greater account connectivity, and a hardware baseline that excludes a substantial portion of the existing installed base. Each of these is individually defensible as part of a coherent product strategy. Together, they create friction for a segment of users who valued Windows for what it was, rather than for what Microsoft is building it to become. The pull is an alternative ecosystem that is genuinely more capable, more accessible, and more credible than at any previous point in Linux's desktop history. The gaming situation has changed, the hardware support has improved, the installation experience has matured, the distribution of evidence that Linux works for everyday computing has expanded. The combination of those two forces, push and pull operating simultaneously on a large population of users at a moment of genuine platform transition, is the context that made 10% conceivable as a Linux desktop figure to anyone who saw the headline. Return to the viral claim that started everything. Here's the precise conclusion that the evidence supports, stated with the specificity it requires. StatCounter did report Linux above 10% in North American desktop web traffic in July 2026. That number is real, in the sense that it is what the measurement produced. It should be reported accurately rather than simply dismissed. That number does not prove that 10% of North American personal computers are running Linux. StatCounter measures web traffic attribution, not installed device census. A significant and unresolved question exists about how much of the Linux attribution in that figure reflects automated and AI-generated traffic, rather than human desktop computer usage. Cloudflare's human traffic data suggests that Linux's share of human desktop browsing looks substantially different from the StatCounter figure. Linux's underlying desktop adoption is nevertheless growing. The growth is real, driven by documented factors, including Windows 10's end of support, Windows 11's hardware exclusions, Proton's gaming compatibility improvements, and increasing developer adoption. That growth may be measured in genuinely increasing percentage points of real desktop usage, but those real gains are considerably smaller than 10%. The July 2026 figure tells a more complicated story than either its celebration or its dismissal captured. It reveals the fragility of web analytics as a proxy for installed device measurement. It reveals the growing influence of automated traffic on statistics that were designed for human browsing, and it reveals the eagerness of an audience that wanted the milestone to be real. Return to where this began, 10%. The number that spread across technology communities in July 2026 with the speed and intensity of something people had been waiting a long time to believe. The careful examination of that number revealed something more interesting than either the celebration or the correction could fully capture. The figure was real in the narrow sense of being what the measurement produced. It was misleading in the larger sense of implying something about Linux's installed base that the evidence does not support. And it was revealing in the deepest sense of showing how badly a significant audience wanted a specific narrative to be true. But here is what matters most about the 10% story, the thing that neither the celebration nor the correction quite reached. Linux does not need to be at 10% of installed desktops to have changed the conversation about desktop computing. The fact that a single StatCounter figure could go viral, could generate genuine discussion in mainstream technology media, could make Windows users across the internet seriously ask whether they were still using the right platform, that is evidence of a shift that percentage points cannot fully capture. Linux has become credible enough that a questionable statistic suggesting its breakthrough is immediately believed by millions of people. That credibility was not present 5 years ago. 10 years ago, a viral claim of Linux at 10% would have been dismissed within hours as obviously impossible. The dismissal did not happen in July 2026. The celebration happened instead, which raises the question worth carrying away from everything this investigation has established. If Linux does not actually need to reach 10% to make Windows users question their platform, if the credibility of the alternative alone is enough to change the conversation, then Microsoft's real challenge may not be the moment Linux crosses a specific market share threshold. It may be the moment users stop assuming that the question of which operating system they use has only one obvious answer. That moment does not require a measurement. It requires only a decision. And there is growing evidence that more people are making it.